sometimes the most ordinary day becomes the moment that changes everything. Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her routine trip to town would end with her life hanging in the balance, or that a stranger's courage would teach her the true meaning of trust. In the dusty frontier town of Cedar Ridge, where lawlessness often ruled and decent folks kept their heads down, one man's decision to stand up would forge a bond that neither time nor hardship could break. This is the story of how a desperate moment of violence brought together two souls who had long ago stopped believing in second chances, and how sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come not from those who seek glory, but from those who simply refuse to look away when others need help. Sarah Mitchell pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she guided her horse-drawn cart along the dusty trail toward Cedar Ridge. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged landscape, and she could already feel the heat beginning to build despite the early hour. At 26, Sarah had made this journey countless times, carrying fresh eggs and vegetables from her small farm to sell at the town market. It was honest work that barely kept her afloat, but it was hers, and, after everything she had endured, independence meant more to her than comfort. The trail wound through a narrow canyon, with rocky walls rising on either side. Sarah had always felt a bit uneasy in this stretch, but it was the fastest route to town, and time meant money when you were trying to sell fresh produce. She urged her old mare, Buttercup, to pick up the pace, eager to reach the more open ground ahead. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Sarah's heart sank. 3 riders blocked the path ahead, their horses standing sideways across the narrow route. Even from a distance, she could see they weren't ordinary travelers. Their clothes were rough and dirty, their faces hard beneath wide-brimmed hats, and the way they sat their horses spoke of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. Sarah's hands tightened on the reins as she brought her cart to a stop. She had heard the stories whispered in town about the Murphy Gang, a group of outlaws who had been terrorizing the area for months. They robbed travelers, rustled cattle, and, worse. The sheriff had tried to track them down, but they seemed to vanish into the hills like smoke whenever the law got close. The leader of the 3 men, a tall figure with a scraggly beard and cold eyes, nudged his horse forward. Well, what do we have here?" he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Pretty lady traveling all alone. That doesn't seem very safe, does it, boys?" His companions laughed, a harsh sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. She forced herself to sit straight and keep her voice steady. "I'm just heading to market in town. I don't have anything of value." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, sweetheart," the leader said, dismounting and walking toward her cart. "See, out here, everything has value. Your horse, your cart, those goods you're carrying." His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her feel sick. "And some things are worth more than others." Sarah's mind raced. She was trapped, with rocky walls on both sides and 3 armed men blocking her only escape route. Buttercup snorted nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Sarah knew she had to try to talk her way out of this, even though every instinct told her these men weren't interested in reasonable conversation. "Please," she said, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "I'm just trying to make an honest living. Take what you want from the cart, but please let me go." The leader laughed again. "Oh, we'll take what we want, all right. But letting you go? Well, that's going to depend on how cooperative you are." One of the other men, a stocky fellow with a scar across his cheek, rode closer to Sarah's cart and began pawing through her carefully packed vegetables. "Not much here, Jake," he said to the leader. "Few eggs, some potatoes and carrots. Hardly worth the trouble." "Like I said, Scar," Jake replied, never taking his eyes off Sarah, "some things are worth more than others. Why don't you climb down from that cart, pretty lady? We can discuss this more comfortable like." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She knew what men like these were capable of, and she knew that once she left the relative safety of her cart, her situation would become desperate indeed. She gathered the reins in her hands, preparing to try to force her way through, even though she knew Buttercup was no match for their horses. That's when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats from behind her. Jake and his men heard it too, their heads turning toward the sound. A single rider appeared around the bend, sitting tall in his saddle on a powerful black horse. Sarah's heart leaped with hope, but then sank just as quickly. What could one man do against 3? The newcomer was tall and lean, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and a face that spoke of a man who had seen his share of hard times. He wore practical clothes, a gun belt at his waist, and rode with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in the saddle. Most importantly to Sarah, his eyes were alert and intelligent as they took in the scene before him. "Morning, folks," he said casually, as if coming upon a roadblock was the most natural thing in the world. "Seems like there might be some kind of problem here." Jake straightened, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "No problem, stranger. Just having a friendly chat with the lady here." "Nothing that concerns you." The newcomer's gaze shifted to Sarah, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. It was recognition, not of her personally, but of the situation she was in. He understood immediately what was happening here. "That's so," he said mildly, his horse taking a few steps closer. "Ma'am, would you say you're having a friendly chat?" Sarah looked between the stranger and the outlaws, her mind spinning. This could be her chance, but it could also make things worse for both of them. I was just trying to get to market in town," she said carefully. "Well, there you have it," Jake said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "She's fine, we're fine, everybody's fine. So why don't you just ride on and mind your own business?" The stranger nodded slowly, as if considering this advice. "You know, that's generally good counsel. Minding your own business, I mean. But I've got a problem." He shifted in his saddle, and Sarah noticed his hand was now resting casually on his gun butt. "See, my mama raised me to be polite to ladies, and something about this situation doesn't seem very polite." Scar spoke up from beside Sarah's cart. "Mister, you're outnumbered 3-1. Might want to think about that before you go sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." "Oh, I've thought about it," the stranger replied calmly. "Thought about it real careful like. And here's what I've decided." His voice changed, becoming harder, more commanding. "The lady's going to turn that cart around and head back the way she came, and you boys are going to let her go without any fuss." Jake laughed, but it sounded forced. "And why would we do that?" "Because if you don't," the stranger said, his hand now openly resting on his gun grip, "things are going to get unpleasant real quick. And, while you might be thinking you've got the numbers, I'm thinking you don't know what you're dealing with." Sarah held her breath, watching the tension build like a storm cloud. She could see the calculation going on behind Jake's eyes, weighing his options. These men were used to intimidating lone travelers, farmers, and townsfolk who couldn't fight back. But this stranger was different. There was something about the way he sat his horse, the confidence in his voice, that suggested he was no ordinary traveler. The moment stretched out like a taut wire, and Sarah knew that whatever happened next would determine whether she lived or died. She found herself studying the stranger's face, wondering what kind of man would risk his life for someone he'd never met. In her experience, most people looked the other way when trouble arose, protecting themselves first and foremost. Jake's hand moved toward his gun, and Sarah saw the stranger's eyes narrow. "I wouldn't," he said quietly, but his voice carried clearly in the canyon air. "I really wouldn't." "You're bluffing," Jake said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Only one way to find out," the stranger replied. "But before you decide, you might want to consider something. You boys have been making a lot of noise in these parts lately. Lot of folks looking for you. Now, you can ride away from here with nothing but wounded pride, or you can make a play and maybe not ride away at all. Your choice." Sarah realized she was holding her breath. Everything depended on what happened in the next few seconds. Would Jake back down, or would his pride force him into a fight that could get them all killed? The outlaw leader stared at the stranger for a long moment, his jaw working as he chewed over his options. Finally, he stepped back from Sarah's cart, though his hand remained near his weapon. "This ain't over, stranger. We'll remember you." "I'm sure you will," the man replied evenly. "Just make sure you remember the lesson along with the face." Jake motioned to his men, and they began backing their horses away from the cart. But Sarah could see the fury in their faces, the promise of future violence. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ma'am, the stranger said, his voice gentle now as he addressed Sarah, I think it might be wise if you turned around and headed back home for today. These boys might decide to follow you if you continue on to town. Sarah nodded, her hands shaking as she began to turn her cart around. But, as she did, Jake called out one more time. This is our territory, stranger. You'd best remember that. And, you, sweetheart, he said to Sarah, we know where you live. We'll be seeing you again real soon. The threat hung in the air like poison as the outlaws finally rode away, disappearing around a bend in the trail. Sarah found herself alone with the man who had just saved her life, and she realized she was trembling uncontrollably. Easy there, the stranger said, dismounting and walking over to her cart. You're safe now. Name's Thomas Brady, but most folks call me Tom. Sarah Mitchell, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Tom's face was grim as he looked in the direction the outlaws had gone. I've got a pretty good idea what would have happened, and I'm glad we didn't have to find out. He looked up at her with kind eyes. But, Sarah, we need to talk about what comes next. Those men weren't bluffing about knowing where you live, and they don't strike me as the type to forgive and forget. Sarah's hands continued to shake as she guided Buttercup back along the trail toward her farm, with Tom riding alongside her on his black horse. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of what had just happened. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger, every sound made her jump. How far is your place? Tom asked, breaking the silence as they reached a wider section of the trail. About 3 miles, Sarah replied, glancing nervously over her shoulder. It's not much, just a small farmhouse and some land my late husband left me. She paused, then added quietly, I've been managing on my own for 2 years now. Tom nodded, understanding more than she said. A woman alone on a remote farm was vulnerable in the best of times, and, with the Murphy gang now having marked her as a target, her situation had become dangerous indeed. As they rode, Sarah found herself stealing glances at her rescuer. There was something solid and reassuring about his presence, but also something guarded, as if he carried secrets of his own. His clothes were well worn but clean, his gear well maintained, and he rode with the easy skill of a man who spent much of his life in the saddle. Most tellingly, she had noticed the confidence with which he had faced down 3 armed men, suggesting this wasn't his first such encounter. You're not from around here, she said, more statement than question. No, ma'am. Just passing through, actually. Was heading to Cedar Ridge to resupply before moving on. He glanced at her. Though it seems like my plans might be changing. You don't need to change your plans because of me, Sarah said quickly, though even as she said it, she felt a stab of fear at the thought of being left alone to face whatever the outlaws might have planned. Tom was quiet for a moment, studying the landscape around them with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to watching for trouble. Those men weren't making idle threats, Sarah. Jake Murphy and his gang have a reputation for following through on their promises, especially the ugly ones. Sarah felt her blood run cold. You know who they are? Jake Murphy's been making trouble from here to Kansas. Him and his boys have left a trail of robbery, violence, and worse across half the territory. The law's been after them for months, but they know this country too well. Tom's expression was grim. A woman alone, especially one who's seen their faces and can identify them, represents a problem they won't ignore. They had reached Sarah's property, a modest spread with a small but well-maintained farmhouse, a barn, chicken coop, and fields that showed the careful attention of someone who worked hard to make the most of what they had. Tom took it all in with a practiced glance, and Sarah could see him noting the isolation of the place, the lack of nearby neighbors, the many approaches that would be difficult to defend. Nice place, he said, and she could tell he meant it. You've done well with it. Thank you, Sarah replied, feeling a small surge of pride despite her fear. James and I worked hard to build this up. After he died, I couldn't bear to leave it. She paused. Though I'm starting to think that might have been a mistake. Tom dismounted and helped Sarah down from her cart, his hand steady and reassuring. Don't sell yourself short. It takes courage to stay and make a go of it on your own. But right now, we need to think about keeping you safe." Over the next hour, Tom walked the perimeter of Sarah's property with her, pointing out potential problems and vulnerabilities. The house sat in a small valley, which provided some shelter from the wind but also meant that someone could approach from the surrounding hills without being seen until they were quite close. There were too many outbuildings to watch effectively, too many places for someone to hide, and only one road in and out. "The good news," Tom said as they finished their survey, "is that your husband built well. This house is solid, and those windows are small enough that it would be hard for someone to shoot through them accurately. The bad news is that if they decide to come after you, you'd be trapped." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the weight of her situation settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. "What do you think I should do? Go to town? Try to get help from the sheriff?" Tom's expression was skeptical. "Sheriff Morrison is a good man, but he's got one deputy and a town to protect. He can't spare men to guard your farm, and, frankly, even if he could, Jake Murphy's shown he's not particularly intimidated by the law." "Then, what?" Sarah's voice carried a note of desperation she tried to hide. "You let me stay and help," Tom said simply. Sarah stared at him, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "You don't even know me. Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Maybe because I know what it's like to need help and not have anyone willing to give it. Maybe because running away from trouble doesn't seem to work as well as I hoped it would." He looked at her directly. "Or maybe because some things are just the right thing to do, regardless of the cost." There was something in his voice, a hint of old pain and regret, that made Sarah wonder about his past. But she also heard the sincerity in his words, and, more importantly, she saw it in his actions. He had already risked his life for her once today, and he was offering to do so again. "I couldn't pay you," she said quietly. "I barely make enough to keep this place going." "I'm not asking for payment," Tom replied. "Just a place to sleep and maybe some of those vegetables I saw in your cart. I've been living on hardtack and beans for longer than I care to remember." Despite everything, Sarah found herself almost smiling. "I think I can manage that." Then, her expression grew serious again. "But, Tom, you need to understand what you're getting yourself into. If those men come here, and they find you helping me, they'll find more than they bargained for," Tom said firmly. "I'm not the same as the farmers and townsfolk they're used to intimidating. I've dealt with their kind before." There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah believe him. She realized she was faced with a choice that went beyond simple survival. She could try to handle this alone, as she had handled everything else since James died, or she could accept help from this stranger who had already shown more courage and decency than she had seen in a long time. "All right," she said finally. "If you're willing to stay, I'd be grateful for the help." Tom nodded. "Then, we'd better start preparing. If I know Jake Murphy, he won't wait long to make his move. Men like him don't like being shown up, especially in front of their gang." They spent the rest of the day turning Sarah's farm into something resembling a fortress. Tom helped her move her animals closer to the house where they could be better protected, and they reinforced the doors and shutters. He showed her how to create good firing positions near the windows and explained how to make the most of the cover the house provided. As they worked, Sarah found herself learning things about Tom through his actions rather than his words. He was careful and methodical, clearly experienced in preparing for trouble. His hands were steady and skilled, whether he was reinforcing a door or checking his weapons. Most importantly, he treated her as an equal partner in their preparations, asking for her input and explaining his reasoning rather than simply giving orders. "You know this land better than I do," he said as they checked the sightlines from the house to various approaches. "If you were trying to sneak up on this place, how would you do it?" Sarah considered the question seriously, thinking about the property she had lived on for 5 years. "Probably from the north, through the woods. There's good cover almost all the way to the barn, and from there it's just a short dash to the house." Tom nodded approvingly. "That's what I was thinking too. We'll need to keep a special eye on that direction." He paused. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me.
Have you ever shot a gun? Sarah nodded. James taught me to use his rifle.
I'm not an expert, but I can hit what I aim at least at close range.
Good. We may need that skill before this is over. Tom's expression was serious.
I hope it doesn't come to that, but hoping and preparing are two different things. As evening approached, they sat on Sarah's front porch, sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and vegetables from her garden. The normalcy of it felt strange after the day's events, but also comforting. For the first time in hours, Sarah felt some of the tension leaving her shoulders.
"Can I ask you something?" she said as they watched the sun begin to set over the hills. "Sure. What were you running from?"
"You mentioned that running from trouble doesn't work as well as you hoped." Tom was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful.
"I was a lawman once.
Deputy marshal, actually, working out of a town in Colorado.
Thought I was making a difference, cleaning up the territory, protecting good people."
He paused, staring out at the horizon.
"Turns out the people I was working for weren't as clean as they claimed to be.
When I found out and tried to do something about it, I found myself on the wrong side of some very powerful men."
"What happened?"
"They framed me for murder. Killed a man I was supposed to be protecting and made it look like I'd done it for money."
Tom's hands clenched into fists. "I had to run, leave everything behind."
Been moving ever since, trying to stay ahead of bounty hunters and corrupt lawmen. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine.
"Are you still wanted?" "Probably. Though it's been over a year now, and I've been careful to stay out of sight."
He looked at her directly. "I'm telling you this because you have a right to know what kind of man you're trusting with your life."
"I'm not a criminal, Sarah, but there are people who would say otherwise."
Sarah studied his face in the growing twilight, seeing the pain and regret there, but also the fundamental decency that had compelled him to help her despite the risk to himself. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm a pretty good judge of character.
And I think the men who framed you made a serious mistake."
"What makes you so sure?" "Because a guilty man would have ridden past me this morning without stopping. A man running from his conscience wouldn't have offered to stay and help defend a stranger's farm." She smiled at him, the first genuine smile she had managed all day.
"Besides, I've seen what real bad men look like, and you're nothing like them."
Tom returned her smile, and, for a moment, the years of pain and running seemed to lift from his shoulders.
"Thank you for that. It's been a long time since anyone looked at me and saw something other than a wanted man."
As full darkness fell, they made their final preparations for what might prove to be a long and dangerous night. Tom took the first watch, positioning himself where he could see the most likely approaches to the house, while Sarah tried to get some rest. But sleep proved elusive, and she found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken in just one day. This morning she had been a lonely widow, struggling to make ends meet and facing each day with quiet determination. Tonight she was a woman marked for death by dangerous outlaws, but she was no longer alone. Tom Brady had changed everything, and not just by saving her from immediate danger. For the first time in 2 years, she felt like she had a true partner, someone she could depend on completely. Outside, she could hear Tom moving quietly around the house, checking and double-checking their defenses. The sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that she was no longer facing the world's dangers by herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the threat hanging over them was far from resolved. But tonight, for the first time since James died, Sarah Mitchell fell asleep feeling truly safe. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of Tom moving quietly around the kitchen. Through her bedroom window, she could see the first pale light of morning creeping across the sky, painting the hills in soft gray tones. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the domestic sounds of someone preparing coffee and breakfast, sounds she hadn't heard in her house since James died. It was both comforting and strange, a reminder of how much her life had changed in just 24 hours. She dressed quickly and found Tom at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee steaming before him as he cleaned his rifle with practiced efficiency. He looked up as she entered, and she was struck again by the steadiness in his dark eyes.
"Morning," he said quietly. "Hope I didn't wake you." "You didn't." I don't sleep much past sunrise anyway.
Sarah poured herself coffee from the pot he had made, noting that it was considerably stronger than she usually prepared.
Any sign of trouble during the night?
Nothing definite, but I heard horses moving around in the hills about midnight.
Could have been wild mustangs, but I doubt it. Tom reassembled his rifle with quick, sure movements.
I think they're watching us, trying to figure out the best way to approach. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with fear, but also with a strange kind of anticipation.
The waiting was almost worse than the actual danger. What do we do? We stay alert and stick to our plan.
If they come, we make them pay a price for it. If they don't, maybe they'll decide we're more trouble than we're worth and move on to easier prey. As they shared a simple breakfast of eggs and bacon, Sarah found herself studying Tom's face, noting the lines around his eyes and the careful way he positioned himself to always have a view of the approaches to the house. She was beginning to understand that this was how he had lived for more than a year, always watching, always ready, never able to fully relax.
Tom, she said hesitantly, what will you do after this is over?
I mean, assuming we both survive it. He was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at her small garden.
I honestly don't know.
I've been drifting so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stop. You could stay here, Sarah said, the words out of her mouth before she had fully thought them through.
I mean, if you wanted to. This place could use a man's touch, and I could use the help. Tom looked at her with surprise and something else she couldn't quite identify. Sarah, that's generous of you, but you don't know me well enough to make that kind of offer. And, besides, there are people looking for me. Staying in one place would be dangerous for both of us.
Maybe, Sarah said, meeting his gaze directly. But running forever doesn't seem to be working out very well for you either. And, as for not knowing you well enough, I think I know the most important things. I know you're brave enough to help a stranger, honorable enough to tell me the truth about your past, and decent enough to respect my choices even when you disagree with them. Before Tom could respond, both of them heard the sound they had been dreading, the drumming of multiple horses approaching at a gallop. Tom was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window. 3 riders coming from the north, just like we expected, he said grimly. It's Jake and his boys, and they're not trying to be subtle about it. Sarah grabbed James's old rifle from where they had positioned it the night before, checking to make sure it was loaded. Her hands were steadier than she had expected, and she realized that having Tom beside her had given her a courage she hadn't known she possessed. The riders pulled up about 50 yards from the house, well within rifle range but far enough away to make for difficult shooting. Jake Murphy sat his horse in the center, with Scar and the third man, whom Tom had identified as Billy Hutchins, flanking him on either side. All 3 had their weapons drawn. "Brady!" Jake called out, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "I know you're in there with the woman. Come on out and we can discuss this like civilized men." Tom positioned himself at the front window, keeping low but making sure his rifle barrel was visible. "I'm comfortable right here, Murphy. If you've got something to say it from where you are." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "All right then, we'll do this the hard way. You've got something that belongs to us, Brady. That woman saw too much yesterday, and she needs to pay for that mistake. The only mistake here is you thinking you can ride onto this property and make threats," Tom called back. "Why don't you boys turn around and ride out of here while you still can?" "Can't do that, Brady. See, word gets around when someone shows up the Murphy gang. Bad for business, if you know what I mean. We've got a reputation to maintain." Sarah had positioned herself at the side window, where she could cover the approach from the barn. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady on the rifle stock. She could see Billy Hutchins edging his horse slightly to the left, trying to get a better angle on the house. "Tom," she said quietly, "the one on the right is moving." "I see him." Tom's voice was calm and focused. "Sarah, when this starts, you stay low and only shoot if you've got a clear target. These men won't hesitate to kill you if they get the chance." Jake was apparently growing tired of the standoff.
Brady, you've got 1 minute to send the woman out, or we're coming in after both of you. And, when we do, things are going to get very unpleasant for everyone involved. Tom glanced back at Sarah, and she saw the apology in his eyes. I'm sorry you got mixed up in this. I'm not, Sarah said firmly. These men would have hurt me yesterday if you hadn't stopped them, and they'd hurt other innocent people if someone doesn't stop them now. At least this way I'm not facing it alone. Her words seemed to give Tom strength, and, when he turned back to the window, his voice was steady and determined. Murphy, your minute's up. What's it going to be? The answer came in the form of gunfire as all three outlaws opened up on the house simultaneously. Bullets splintered the wooden shutters and whined off the stone foundation, but Tom and Sarah's careful preparations paid off. The small windows and thick walls provided excellent protection, and they were able to return fire without exposing themselves to serious danger. Tom's first shot took Billy Hutchins out of his saddle, the outlaw crying out as he tumbled to the ground clutching his shoulder. Sarah's shot went wide, but it was close enough to Scar's head to make him duck and spur his horse to the side, spoiling his aim. Good shooting, Tom called to her as he levered another round into his rifle. Keep them moving. The battle settled into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the outlaws trying to find positions where they could get clear shots at the house, while Tom and Sarah worked to pin them down and make them pay for every yard they gained. Jake proved to be both cunning and persistent, using his superior knowledge of tactics to keep his remaining men in the fight even after Billy went down. But, as the morning wore on, it became clear that the advantage lay with the defenders. Tom's experience and steady nerves made him a deadly shot, and Sarah proved to be more capable with a rifle than even she had expected. More importantly, they had good cover and prepared positions, while the outlaws were exposed in the open ground around the house. The turning point came when Jake tried to circle around to the back of the house, thinking to catch them in a crossfire. But Tom had anticipated this move, and he slipped out the back door while Sarah kept Scar pinned down with rifle fire from the front window. Jake never saw him coming until Tom's rifle was pointed at his chest from 20 feet away. Drop it, Murphy, Tom said quietly. This has gone far enough. Jake's face went through a series of expressions: rage, calculation, and, finally, grudging acceptance. He let his pistol fall to the ground and raised his hand slowly. Scar, he called out. It's over. Stand down. The scarred outlaw looked around desperately, seeing his leader captured and Billy moaning on the ground with a wounded shoulder. Finally, he too threw down his weapon and raised his hands. Smart choice, Tom said, never taking his eyes or his rifle off Jake. Sarah, you can come out now. It's over. Sarah emerged from the house, still carrying James's rifle, and Tom felt a surge of pride at the way she held herself. She had faced mortal danger with courage and skill, proving herself to be far stronger than even she had known. What do we do with them now? She asked, looking at the three defeated outlaws. We take them to town and turn them over to Sheriff Morrison, Tom replied. Let the law deal with them from here. The ride to Cedar Ridge was tense but uneventful, with the wounded Billy tied to his saddle and the other two outlaws riding with their hands bound. Tom and Sarah followed behind, alert for any sign of an escape attempt, but the fight seemed to have gone out of Jake and his gang. Sheriff Morrison was both surprised and grateful to see the notorious Murphy gang brought in alive. Tom Brady, he said, studying the wanted posters on his desk after Tom had quietly explained the situation, I've got paper on you from Colorado, but I also know the story behind those charges. Far as I'm concerned, bringing in these three more than balances the scales. What does that mean? Sarah asked. It means I'm going to lose that paperwork somewhere in my files, and Mr. Brady here is free to start over wherever he chooses. The sheriff looked at Tom meaningfully. Might be this area could use a man with his skills, if he was inclined to settle down. As they walked back to Sarah's cart, she could see Tom struggling with the decision that lay before him. For more than a year, he had been running, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. The idea of settling down, of having a normal life again, was both appealing and terrifying. Tom, Sarah said as they reached the cart, I meant what I said this morning. The offer stands, if you want it. He looked at her for a long moment, seeing not just the woman he had saved from the outlaws,
but a partner who had stood beside him in battle, who had trusted him with her life and had proven herself worthy of his trust in return. "You sure about this?" he asked.
"I come with a lot of baggage, Sarah. A man like me might bring trouble you don't need."
"A man like you brought trouble to 3 outlaws who thought they could terrorize innocent people," Sarah replied.
"Besides, I've had enough of being alone.
This place needs 2 people to make it work right, and I think we make a pretty good team." Tom smiled, and, for the first time since his world had fallen apart in Colorado, he felt like he might actually have a future worth looking forward to. "Well then, partner, I guess we'd better head home and figure out how to make this work." As they drove back toward the farm together, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 days. She had gone from being a lonely widow, barely scraping by on her own, to being part of a partnership built on mutual respect, shared danger, and growing trust. Tom had saved her from the outlaws, but, in doing so, he had also saved her from the isolation and fear that had been slowly eating away at her spirit. For Tom, the change was even more profound. After months of running and hiding, of being afraid to trust anyone or stay anywhere long enough to matter, he had found something worth fighting for and someone who saw past his troubled past to the man he really was. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and uncertainties, but also full of possibilities. They had proven they could count on each other when times were hardest, and that was a foundation strong enough to build a life on. Sarah had offered him her trust, and he had proven himself worthy of it. Now they would face whatever came next together, as partners in every sense of the word. As the sun set behind them, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Sarah and Tom headed home to begin building the life they had both thought was lost to them forever. Sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms, and sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply choosing to trust in the possibility of a better tomorrow.